Michelle,
Daniel, OG
OG
Rose,
Rose.
And Sandy.
Sandy. So we are thrilled because Sandy's great. And today we're just so honored because Sandy's been reading thoughts and wanted to have a conversation about it. So we're really excited to be here to have that opportunity. And we're going to pass it over to Sandy to be the host. So Sandy, how you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you doing?
We're
Thank you
doing
for
well.
having me on the conversation again.
Of
Oh,
course.
always our pleasure, Sandy.
Well, I just wanted to congratulate you both on thoughts. It's a beautiful reflection of so many different thoughts, and I was fascinated and I thought, why not have an interrogation of my own about it? It is certainly a comprehensive collection of its own kind, Daniel. You guys have done very well.
Well, thank you, Sandy.
Thank you, Sandy.
So let's talk about it. Let's not waste time. Okay.
Let's get right into
Yes.
it.
So I've been gravitating on ideas and the philosophy of mind and memory. And the first chapter, you compare ideas to being practically eyes.
Mm.
Now, that's a fascinating analogy because eyes could mean lenses, perspective, different views on life and philosophy. And it made me think of René Descartes because he talks about mind and the most important part of a brain is the mind, and mind is an attribute and the brain is a finite substance. But then Plato says that that's not the truth because ideas have to be existing knowledge and fact. So I wanted to ask you, why did you compare ideas to eyes? What inspired you to do that?
That's a great question. Well, ideas have a big impact on how we interpret the world. And we tend to actually see our interpretation of things more than things. Like right now, arguably, this laptop is a bunch of atoms, it's a bunch of parts, but I don't really see any of that. I see the holistic whole of laptop. And we basically go through our day having our perspective influenced by eyes a lot more than we realize. And although although ideas are not technically eyes, they practically are eyes because all practice is through an intellectual lens. It's through a lens of ideas. So for example, if I think it's a good use of time to eat ice cream, then that idea impacts my practice. And so I go through the world trying to always get ice cream. And if it's banana ice cream, that would be true. So you have two senses in which ideas are practically eyes, both in how we tend to see our impressions and ideas of things in practice, unless we stop. Now, here's the thing, like we stop and go, wait a minute, this laptop is made of atoms, this laptop is a bunch of parts, and I'm bringing it into kind of an emergent whole. Well, then we can, but that's not really in practice. Now we've kind of moved into the Descartesian meditation, right? Where we're now stopping and looking at things. So a really important line in this is practically eyes, which has, and in the work of O.G. Rose, the distinction between technical and practical is very loaded. There's a lot going on there because very often, actually what is practically real is more real for humans than what is technically real. We don't tend as human beings to live in a technical space. We live in a practice space. And if ideas are practically always combined with practice, then ideas are practically eyes because they are the lenses by which we interpret the world. And that impacts what we see and how we organize ourselves.
Michelle, what do you think?
Well, I think the distinction Daniel brought up about like the practically and technically is really important because the practice is sort of like what we tend to practice things through our eyes and what we see in our vision. And I think like it often is how we see things is going to impact what we do with our time. What is the things that we're doing on a regular basis. We could think about this as habitual, but I know, Sandy, you like to make the distinction between habit and practice, right? Because practice is a bit more, I want to say, I don't like this word very much, but there's a little bit of a way in which it's a bit more intentional. And it can be a bit more of something you have to kind of put some work into. Whereas like habit, yes, it's similar, but I always think about the connection of habit and habitat, how it's often what you feel comfortable in and what feels, you can often seek it as like a refuge from having to do work actually. So I think the practice often is like what you kind of have to be a bit more intentional about doing day in and day out. And I think sometimes like with this idea of ideas are practically eyes, we have to kind of like it connects really well with the Daniel's distinction between dreams and vision, where like your vision is actually what kind of orients your practice. And so I think that there's a really good and important connection here with what we see and how we see things, and how our practice also feeds into how we see things, right? And vice versa, and how we see things feeds into what we choose to practice on a daily basis and day-to-day basis. So I think that's what it makes me think of. And I think the piece too is speaking to the fact that a lot of times ideas are thought of as depending on the context, but a lot of times ideas are thought of as kind of impractical.
Right.
Because, well, why are you thinking about that? Or why does it matter to ask those questions? Or blah, 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 blah. That doesn't really relate to like what you have to, what you have to do or your job or anything like that. But ideas are everything, actually. Ideas are everything. And that's the thing. If you have glasses and you're so used to wearing them, you see everything through them, right? And that's how ideas are. We do see everything through those ideas. We do see everything through our ideas of things, right? So anyways, I just think there's something about this idea of the essay trying to really speak to the fact that ideas are fundamental, very important, and in a sense, like inescapable, right? It's as if we all actually do have glasses on because of our ideas. So I think that was another part of it too, to kind of speak to why do ideas matter? Why does it matter to think about why they matter and such things, which is a little bit meta, but I think it's important.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, you can't have a hard distinction between being practical and being an idea person, because your definition of practical is relative to your idea of what you think constitutes practice.
Right.
And so you can't have, like you have in society, this like hard split between, oh, I'm an idea person, or oh no, I'm just a practical person.
Yeah.
Well, the issue is, if you don't think ideas, then your definition of practice will probably just be a replication of the zeitgeist or the spirit of the age, and you may not even realize it.
Very true. So could we say that ideas are knowledge? What do we think of that? Because ideas are so important, and everything we do is stimulated from thought that eventually go on to being an idea that we execute. So is there a possibility to say that ideas are knowledge?
Well, that's a big question, because it's possible to practice an idea that's false. Like an idea you could practice, that's actually the rub, right? Is ideas are always practically eyes, and they organize our practice. And problematically, we all have ideas. The issue is, if we're not intentional about our ideas or think about ideas, they tend to be bad ideas, and that can lead us to issues. So certainly, I think when you get into questions like, what is truth? What is knowledge? What is fact? What is idea? What is concept? What is notion? Oh boy, you've got a lot of overlapping circles that don't necessarily overlap with the other circles, right? So all knowledge is going to also be an idea, but not all ideas are necessarily knowledge. Now, you could also make a distinction between belief and knowledge, like Jonathan Rauch or Karl Popper does, where a belief is something that may be true, but it cannot be falsified. And since it cannot be falsified, it cannot be tested to be knowledge, as in not contingent upon subjectivity, right? And then once you get to knowledge, you say, okay, it's knowledge, but is it true? Maybe it's just something we're tested that is a part of the truth, maybe, but it may not be the whole of the truth. So, you have knowledge. If it's knowledge, it has something to do with truth, but it may not, like capital T, the big truth, if you will, but it may not have something to do with the whole of the truth, right? And then you go from there and from there and from there.
Right. And I feel like with all the reflections, for me, a theme that stood out was really the epistemology of mind and thought. Yes. I think I was just very much fixating on the title of the book, which is thought. And it's simple, but it's broad, and it's very thought-provoking. And as I said, it certainly is a comprehensive collection. Now, I remember exchanging emails with you, Daniel, about this, like, let's discuss the philosophy of the mind. And one of the chapters is called Memory is the Mind's Heir. And I think it's a wonderful chapter. It's one of my favorites. And that really got me thinking about, when we talk about memory, there is memorizing versus remembering. And how do we make a formal distinction between the two? Because oftentimes we're so influenced by whatever we read, whatever we see, whatever we go about doing in our day, that becomes memory, and somehow we replicate it as remembering something we memorized. So how would you say one would be able to make a fine distinction between memory and remembrance?
For me, the big distinction between memorization and remembering is, when you memorize something, you pull it into your present and the construct of the world today. Whereas with remembering, you put yourself in the world of the thing that you are recalling. So in a sense, you could say remembering is empathizing with history, whereas memorization is a kind of violence to history, where you pull history into the present and reduce it to the present. That's one of the reasons why the school system arguably can be very problematic if all it does is have memorization. Because what you're doing is, you're not responsible for, say, entering the world in which the facts are situated in, or whatever you're learning. And in fact, you just pull it into now, and you're kind of treating it as a means to an end, actually, for the test. So it's kind of like reducing it to its pragmatic use. And also that really doesn't train what I think is basically the only way to have critical thinking, which is the development of empathy, because empathy is not merely sympathy, but the ability to step into an entire another system of thought and to occupy its internal consistency and try to understand the world through its terms. Empathy is like is a radically intellectual act. And we associate empathy a lot with emotion. And of course, it has something to do with it. But that's because it is a radically complex act. And if you really want to think, you have to take into account all layers of the human being, right? Including the emotional. So for me, remembering requires, well, you have to step out of yourself, right? You have to go to what you're recalling as opposed to pull what you're recalling to you. And this is a very different act. So that's what I would start to say is the distinction between those.
Yeah, I think that's good, Daniel. And I think it's a great question, Sandy. I think too, it's neat to think about like how the word remember is even kind of indicative of this distinction, because there's a way in which like it just makes you think of like member or the members of the body or something like that. Like, and I think about the term a lot. And if we think about like sacred text or religion, where there's this idea of like, remember the Lord your God, right? Well, that's to remember that you're also a member of God, right? Or the collective, or this like larger, you know, if you think about it in those terms. And so in that way, there's a type of remembering that then gives you a whole mode of being, right? Whereas memorization can be fairly arbitrary. It's not that there's anything wrong with it, but if we think about it in terms of like memorization as a type of skill that is, you know, separating and reducing facts, reducing information, it doesn't really, there's no way to understand it in the context of life itself, right? So yes, like in a sense, remembering is going to take some memory capacity, like if we're thinking cognitively, right? But if we think of a distinction just philosophically, there's a way in which remembering is to be in a mode of remembering, right? To have like your memory be a mode versus memory be I don't know, almost more the what instead of the how, right? Like what are you remembering? Like, are you remembering these facts and dates? And a lot of times, like memorization is, again, like if we think about this from a religious perspective, memorizing scripture would be a way to remember the Lord your God, right? However, if you just memorize and forget that the reason why you're memorizing is so that you are being a member of God, then it becomes very devoid of its meaning, right? And it becomes very devoid of even its purpose and its, you know, what it's meant to do to memorize those things. That's why with kids, if you're like in school, if it's a lot of just like, you have to remember this or memorize this, it's kind of like they forget it after they have to regurgitate it, you know, and they can sometimes forget the beauty and the meaning that memorizing can do in its cognitive function as related to the philosophical understanding of remembering. I hope that made sense, but that's what it makes me think of.
And I'll just add, that's very good. And it makes me think how remember is putting back together. And there's this interesting kind of paradox where to remember, you have to go to the past and join that world, and you're actually put together by like going outside yourself. Whereas when you pull in memorization to you and you pull it out of the past, that actually pulls you apart as well. Yeah. You would think that if you brought it to you, it would help put you together, but it actually kind of fragments you precisely to what you're saying, because it's the practice itself of which kind of creates you. And if you engage in a practice of pulling and fragmenting the past to your ends, that actually trains you to be a fragmented being, as opposed to when you go to the past and you're doing the remembering, that's putting you together. So that's an interesting point you made.
Yeah. Michelle, I quite like the analogy of fate that you use there. And just circling back to ideas, this is probably going to open Pandora's box.
Great.
When we talk about God, now God could be an idea, frankly speaking, and it's a glorified idea because some are more godly than the others. And you know, if we had to think about it, it's how we glorify the Lord or praise the Lord in our mind, and eventually mind is full of thoughts, and that's the natural attribute of it. So my question is, if we were just to discuss this, aside from discussing thoughts, is God an idea in that sense? Because yes, we memorize scripture and that brings us closer to God, or rather we have that as a guide to reflect back or reinforce our values. But then he or she does become an idea in our head because it's glorified differently. My idea of God is very different to yours because our minds are very different, and uniquely so. So does that make God an idea? Is my question.
That's a great question, Sandy.
I know.
I want to just Pandora's box.
Yes.
Well, I mean, I think that's why, and you know, we've had some discussions on this, and some of the topics have come up in the net discussions that Daniel hosts and that are great. And is the idea of like the apathetic aspect of God, where you hold space for the idea of God, but then you also hold space. Well, it's almost like you hold open all that you cannot understand or comprehend about God. And then even God is not really the right word, even for this notion of what is beyond our concept, beyond our comprehension of God. So I think, I mean, the long and the short of it is, I think we have to hold space for both, right? The fact that there's elements and aspects and the nature of God that is beyond our comprehension. That's the apathetic too, in a sense that it's almost like the God, not God of Eckhart, right? Because it's not because it's non-existent, but more so that we can't comprehend it. So we can't really define it in our language, which kind of, we have to use language as a means to understand each other, but it also is very limiting, right? So there's the space for that, if we can call it a space even. And then there's the idea of God, right? Which is in a sense, I think, a portal. I think they're supposed to be dialectical between the two. This kind of apathetic and I always forget the affirmative God word. Capathetic, thank you. Understanding of God, right? So I think that's what I would say. I think, you know, our idea of God, I think actually, at least I would speak to the fact that understanding the apathetic God, this not God, the God that's beyond our comprehension, I think that's important to inform your idea of God, because you don't, if your idea of God becomes so solidified and never dialectical with the apathetic, then it can become an idol, which is a strange thing to think about, but it can become, it actually ends up, the risk is that it becomes a lower G case God, right? A God of your own creation, a God of your own kind of what you want it to be, right? What you want God to be. And that's not God then, right? Like God is his own entity, more powerful and more, you know, and beyond kind of the form that we know. But we have to have some access point to God to even think about God, right? And so that's why often, again, if we think about religions, there's often kind of a messenger, right? Or a burning bush, a symbol that is a token of the symbol of God that is much bigger than our language. So I hope that makes sense. I think God is an idea and beyond the idea, basically.
No, it's a tremendous question. You know, there's a way in which the planet Pluto is always an idea. You know, you never experience Pluto, right? There's the idea where the full subjectivity and mind of another person is always an idea, and different things like that. So there are lots of things that are ideas, but aren't merely ideas. And arguably everything is an idea, because even this bookshelf right here is, you know, when I experience it, I'm mostly experiencing the idea of bookshelf, not all the parts, not all the angles, not all the colors. We very rarely ever fully experience anything. And in fact, ideas have the function of filling in the blanks of what we don't experience, so that we're not paralyzed by our not actually knowing what's going on. And there's a sense in which you're almost always existing in some kind of simulation, although I don't want to push that too far. That doesn't mean it's false, though. You know, just because you have an idea that maybe is not the complete idea or is not the whole idea, it does not follow that it is therefore false, or has nothing to do with what the thing is in of itself, right? And so, yeah, God absolutely is an idea. And the question is the following: what is the nature of this idea? So in fact, actually, theology can teach you, in my opinion, to think about everything. Because because if you do if you have an idea of God and you say the idea equals God, that's heresy and you're an idol, and that's a problem. But then you also have this problem where you say the idea has nothing to do with God. Then what are you talking about, right? You end up in pure apathatic and you end up utterly confused. But likewise, if you look at that bookcase and say, oh, it equals my idea, well, that's a major problem because it doesn't. But if also you say the idea of bookcase has nothing to do with the bookcase, that's a massive problem as well, because how do you function? How do you relate to the world? So you're always looking for this solid openness. You're always looking for an idea that is able to revise itself, that's held like, Michelle talks about the open bird. You have an idea on an open hand, you don't clutch it because then that's a problem, but you also don't drop it because now you're like an epistemic nihilist, right? So you have to have an open hand. And when it comes to God, it's very important to have this open hand, because if we follow the debate between the apathetic and the capathetic, the great challenge is a way of knowing God that doesn't make God unknowable, but still keeps him unknown. You want God to always be unknown, as in there's always more and infinitely more to know that you don't know. But you also don't want to say that God is unknowable, because then how do you even know you're talking about God? Like when you say anything about God, it's completely empty. And at that point, it's a kind of empty void. You might as well talk about the void or the great capital C cat. Why not? So, because you can't have intelligibility. So certainly God is an idea. And basically, frankly, if you take seriously this notion that you can never escape ideas. And in fact, ideas are a kind of threat because ideas present themselves as the solid whole when they are not. So you always have to be working against them. But then you also always have to be working not to overly deconstruct them, because then you get postmodernity generally. Well, that means you better take thinking very seriously. And you have to go through all these methods of thinking and epistemology and all the different papers and different things, because then thinking becomes it's like cooking. It becomes like an art form, like cooking. You can't just throw all the salt in there. It's going to suck. You can't just throw all the ingredients randomly. There's an order, there's a timing, there's a degree, there's a setting. Like, there's a million more variables to cooking than merely putting the ingredients together. There's a percentage, there's a ratio, and all these things. And we generally have not thought about thinking metaphorically like cooking. We've thought about thinking not as an art form, but more of a binary. You either true, false. It's a true thought or it's a false thought. But no, thinking is more so participating in entities and actually creatively engaging with those things to transform how they present themselves to the world and how we condition ourselves to them. So thinking becomes far more of an art form like cooking than it becomes merely a representation or correspondence with reality. And I think theology can teach that regarding God.
Indeed, that's very true. And a few things that you said will lead up to the next question. I think you've used all the variables needed to write this book brilliantly, and I would like to discuss that a little bit. But before we move on to that, let's talk about the epigraph. Now, Daniel, you are a good reader, and I know this personally. So why did you choose Kierkegaard's particular quote for the epigraph, that it belongs to the imperfection of everything human, that man can only attain his desire by passing through its opposite? Why this one particularly?
Well, because first off, thinking is really, really, really in the business of landing on a solid thing and never thinking again. Thinking doesn't want to think. Thinking wants to achieve certainty and be done with thinking. Thinking has a kind of death drive that is inherently part of thinking itself. And so the only way that thinking can be of use is if you submit thinking to what thinking doesn't want to be submitted to. And that tends to be its opposite. And that also entails for desire to actually not lead to negativity, like pathology and all the stuff Lacan. It has to go through its opposite to earn itself, to kind of go through a certain purgatory, because purgatory, very importantly, is kind of the road to heaven. You have to actually be, in a sense, purified is kind of the notion of purgatory. Now we can get into the metaphysics of all that, but really basically I always like how Cardinal Newman put it. He's like, purgatory is when you take a bath before you see God, because it's really embarrassing to see, like, the pinnacle of existence when you're still covered in dirt. Like, I don't even like having people over if I'm wearing sweatpants, let alone going before God or something, right? So there's a notion in which you could say tearing with the negativity is a Zizekian term. Dialectically working through negativity in a kind of Hegelian sense. These are the things we must submit ourselves to if, in fact, we are not going to undergo effacement or pathology. And likewise, again, we have not thought about thinking itself as something that has to go through these things. And we don't even think about desire as something to go through these things, because we basically go, oh, if I desire it, it's good. Oh, if I think it, it corresponds. And we don't think about working it through its opposite or considering the other side, which would bring in dialectical thinking. And we certainly do not think challenging our desire to find out if the desire actually is what we think it is, or if instead it's some sort of trap stringing us along to an encounter with a Lovecraft beast or something. So those would be some reasoning. Also, Kierkegaard's pretty great.
He is. This is very true. I'm going to ask a very obvious question. Now, there are 100 reflections. Is there a reason that they're listed this way?
Oh, well, I'm not going to tell you that. There is,
I just want to know your inspirations, and I'm sure all the listeners would like to know too, because they do have a consistent theme, which we'll get onto at some point. But why are they placed the way they are?
They may be ordered in a particular reason for a particular way to generate perhaps thought between that certain ordering, or it could be random.
Just throwing darts on a board, like, where does it land?
I'll take the mystery. What do you think, Michelle?
Oh, well,
This one to her. What do you do?
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, I know Daniel, so I know that the intentionality is always there. I'll just say that. I'll leave it at that.
Right. That was very well answered. That was good, Michelle. That was good. That was very good. Now, let's talk about hope and expectation, because that's another reflection that I really enjoyed. The second chapter of the book. Hope entails expectations, but expectation isn't hope. What is the distinction, Daniel?
Well, the distinction would be that there's a difference between hoping for something you're open toward and working toward, as opposed to expectation where you impose it upon the world. Like in the same way that a lot of times these distinctions in thought has a lot to do with the ordering of you in the world or I and other. Like, you know, the notion of memorization and remember, right? There's the difference between pulling the world to you as opposed to you to going to the world. Expectation is when you say the world ought to be X, Y, and Z way. And if it's not, there's something wrong with the world. Whereas in hope, you are indeed putting yourself toward a future. You see a possibility, but the onus is on you to go toward that. And also, if the world does not match that hope, the world is not in the wrong. You instead hope in such a manner to be ready for the unexpected, to meet the unexpected. And indeed, human beings need to have hope. Human beings don't do very well without hope. They have no way to organize their future. But the problem is there's a kind of simple tendency where hope becomes expectation, where you hope for something and you therefore expect it to be that way. And at that point, you don't have to be open, you don't have to be creative, you don't have to improv, you don't have to pivot. And in fact, if the world doesn't go according to your expectation, you're kind of a victim. It's like you deserve like pity in a way, and people owe you because things didn't go the way that you expected. Whereas when you hope, like if things don't go the way and you don't respond to them in a manner that meets them in that unexpected, pivots and creates with that, well, that's your responsibility, right? So hope puts the responsibility on you. Expectation puts the responsibility on the other. And that transforms how you engage with the future and how you move forward in different things. And indeed, you have to hope, like, for example, if you're working a certain job, you have to hope you're going to be paid next week. Otherwise, you wouldn't do it. And there's a sense in which it is reasonable to practically expect you're going to, I'm not saying that I'm going to be a grammar Nazi, it depends on how you use the word expect. And there's a sense in which you can practically expect to make the paycheck because that is what was agreed to in the terms of the agreement. But you see, even in that example, if there's a certain like unreasonable expectation when the boss comes and says, well, actually, I'm afraid to say that, none of our customers paid the bills. We don't have the money yet. Can you wait another week? If you have an over expectation, you may like say no, blow up on your boss, and now you've lost your job. Whereas when you're able to move in hope and be reasonable in that unexpected variable, you can keep the job. And actually that may strengthen your relationship with your boss because you've proven that you're reasonable. Now, if he's literally taking advantage of you, that's a different matter where then you leave and you have to make those, but you can make those judgments from a place of hope. It is not the case that you have to have expectation from which to make those sort of judgments and to act in those decisions. So that distinction is again really kind of bringing out the difference between being open to the world and moving in the world in a manner that's trying to realize things, as opposed to expecting the world to meet you and where you are. And if it doesn't, then the world's in the wrong and you're not responsible for that. So it changes the onus quite a bit.
I just want to say really quick, Sandy, and Daniel, I thought that was really great, and it's a great question, Sandy. I think that, the topic's really interesting to me as well. Like, I think there's something really interesting because it's, of course, like everything, it's just, there's nuance to it. It's
right.
Can be complicated because, I think generally speaking, I had this experience recently where there was a sense of disappointment when something I was expecting didn't happen, right? I mean, that's what Daniel's talking about, right? This idea that we build up these expectations and then we're shocked somehow that, what we envisioned going the way we wanted it to didn't go the way we wanted it to. And it really made me think about something that I'd been thinking on related to Caputo's ideas of hope and expecting the unexpected. And for me, what it really hit me like a ton of bricks, this very succinct line, which was like, the problem was that I was expecting what I was expecting. Yep. That's the problem. It's not so much when you have a spirit of expectation. A spirit of expectation is what I would align with hope, right? There's a hope for the beautiful, the true, and the good. That might not necessarily go according to your finite human, self-absorbed plan, not that we're like all self-absorbed, and not that even a want is necessarily self-absorbed. Okay, that's why it's very complicated and nuanced. But there can be ways in which when we get very certain, any type of certainty is going to often set us up for disappointment, right? And so I think the spirit of expectation allows you to remain open. You might have hopes and even what we could call expectations in the sense of, hopes, like things you're wishful thinking about, but I think the whole idea of shifting to hope versus expectation is to start to expect the unexpected, actually be open and be ready and willing to understand that it's probably what you don't expect is on the horizon. And that's really much more true to life. I mean, I think about it as a mother. The day is extremely, like, yes, we have a rhythm for life, but there's so many unexpected things that occur, you know, and you have got to learn to go with the flow with that. Otherwise, you just be completely, you know, driven crazy by it. But if you learn to kind of go with the flow and realize that, yes, like life does present all of these unexpected things, then you know, it's funny because there's a constant in it. It's the mode of motherhood, right? The mode of being present with the children. That's what's going to inform and allow you to have an expectation of the unexpected, right? So in that way, I think this expecting the unexpected is the hope, right? It's the hope that then kind of allows you to be more in a mode of openness, to be more accepting, and to actually be more present and hopefully more joyful in what you're doing, because you don't get disappointed as easily. You know, you don't just like constantly set yourself up for disappointment, because you have an openness that is hope, and hope is always kind of towards something bigger than yourself. And yes, it's related to you, right? But actually what you kind of allow yourself to be open to the bigger than yourself, the bigger beauty, the bigger truth, the bigger goodness, and allow yourself to be open to it in your finite experience. So I hope that spoke to it. But I'm just, to me, that was like such a big life lesson for me. I was like, oh, right, I was expecting what I was expecting. And that was what was the problem about it, you know? And so anyways, I think that's, to me, what's interesting about the topic. And yeah, how I would think of hope in terms of this unexpectedness.
That's brilliant. Yes, expect the unexpected. But I also feel like it's a very thin line. When you expect the unexpected, you could also hope for better. That means you have greater expectations from the unexpected.
Yeah.
That's also an element that can sort of set us up for disappointment, because innately humans are selfish. That means we expect things to go our way or even better. Mm-hmm. I feel like hope and expectations can more or less be the same thing if you think about it in a very selfish manner, because if you expect better or hope for better, that's still a greater expectation than of the unexpected. And that means that it goes hand in hand. And I feel like when we talk about hope and expectations and, you know, the frame of thought and how the mind works, innately our mind always wants to expect better. Mm-hmm. At least the majority, unless you make a conscious effort to talk yourself out of it, of having any expectations. And that is a very tedious task to do when you have to talk yourself out of something. But innately, your mind or your train of thought sets you up to expect more, or want better from what is unexpected. I think that's the whole point. When you say, let's go with the flow, you know, we'll find out. We want to find out better. We don't want to find out worse. We really don't. And I think that's very interesting. And when we talk about ideas, and I mean, ideas are a different mode of thinking, and there are different modes of thinking, which could be judging, meditating, debating. All those things are part of ideas, because we do wrestle in our heads. And I feel like with hope and expectation and connecting it to thought, it really is a thin line. And when you make that that distinction in your head between hope and expectation, how do you really convince yourself to not be disappointed in the end, even after having said what the two of you just said? How do you do that? It's a rhetorical question, really. I'm trying to get my own answers here from, you know, OG Rose, because Daniel has the answers to everything, and so do you, Michelle.
No. Oh no, that's why we have more questions and more questions. Yeah, right. And a load of questions, you know. That's it. The
roles are reversed here. Usually you ask all the brilliant questions, but it's on me today.
Well, you're asking some brilliant questions, Sandy.
I try.
It's a really, really important thing what you're bringing up here. And it makes me think a lot about self-deception, which Daniel will talk about. I think, yeah, if we're very honest with ourselves, when we expect even when we decide we expect the unexpected, we're still expecting something. The unexpected for us has a placeholder of something bigger, better, greater, more that we want. And so it's very, very hard to actually, like you said, it's a very tedious process to actually really be open to the unexpected. And I don't know if that's just, I think for me, I think the only way, and look, like we're all humans, so we often fall back, even when we've done the tedious work, we can easily fall back into expecting something or hoping for something we want. I think that it's, a lot of it has to do with, I don't know, practicing letting go, because I think to me, it often has to, it's very tied to letting go, you know, letting go of, you know, what you want to see happen or what you want to do. Now, at the same time, the other thing that kind of can complexify it is just that you do have to sort of have, you know, with the word expectations, you sort of sometimes also have to set yourself in a rhythm of you know, basically like you can't just have this, let's just say you could have this idealized capital H hope that's great and you're open to the unexpected. Well, you're just sitting around, like, are you what? You're just going to sit around and hope like that your book gets out there? You know, like you have to do stuff. You have to do something. So I think a lot of times, you know, people, hope can fall into the just sort of like, you know, wishful thinking. But see, that's still not the right type of hope either. Because hope, again, I think for me, it's always really important to think about the what versus the how. Hope should be a mode, right? It should be a mode, like the remembering a mode for existing, right? And learning to essentially see like the fact that there's hope is almost always already and to come. So it's like this dual process of anticipatory, but also existing already in your own existence, right? So yeah, like kind of being the hope, essentially. I don't know how else to put it. Because then instead of it being about like this external thing, which I think, you know, Daniel touched a little bit on when you asked about the quote on desire, psychoanalysis is really important here. Instead of it always being about the externalities that we're trying to get, trying to reach, trying to grasp, trying to clutch, trying to get more of, you know, we bring it down to, wait, we don't actually ever have any of that. You know, we never can, or not for long, you know, and then what we do have is essentially like our own existence. And what are you doing with that? So that's what I would say. It's still a very complicated question, though. It's hard, but yeah.
No, I mean, what you're pointing to is that a few things. One, you have this massive problem in philosophy where just because you make a division in terms does not mean that actually in the practicing of those terms there is any division at all. And yet, you must make a division in terms in order to point to separate realities because humans are trapped in language, right? Like you have to, so someone could write another paper and just flip it. They could say like, hope is bad, expectation is good, right? But you have to make some sort of distinction of terms. And this is actually why I think philosophy basically is doomed if it is not phenomenological, because you must be making the distinction on terms based on phenomenological differences you've seen in people who have different modes of looking to the future, because both expectation and hope is a kind of orientation to the future, right? And it seems as if there are different orientations to the future, right? Well, to discuss those different orientations, you could either call them orientation 1 or orientation 2. That's hard to communicate, or you can talk about hope and expectation, right? Where you choose different terms. Now, the issue is if you, in the middle of a thought, well, and what happens in philosophy actually is people will make distinctions without phenomenological experience to be sure that that distinction is warranted. So they end up making a bunch of distinctions that actually aren't distinctions or are not valid. And that can create a lot of problems. And this is basically why I think philosophy that is not phenomenological, I don't want to say it's doomed, but it basically is doomed. It has to be really, really, really bound to experience, like profoundly. Now, the other thing too, that bookcase over there, I could easily call a page holder. There's a lot of pages in there. I could call it a page holder. But I exist in a social order where nobody calls that a page holder. So if I try to change the term, the very social order itself will stop me from making that change, right? But if I start calling hope expectation or a hidden expectation hope, there's no agreed upon social reality to make me realize I'm making that mistake. You know, nothing's going to go, oh, bing, bonk. You're actually now using expecting the unexpected as an expectation. I hear those sounds all the time. Right, you hear with the kids, right? So
that makes distinction for me.
Yeah, metaphysical realities do not tell you you're making the mistake. So this is why you have to be so aware of your thinking to realize that you're not just making a distinction that's an empty distinction, and actually it's a sneaky way to self-deceive yourself into thinking you're not expecting when you actually are expecting. Now, what I would say the major test is when you're like sitting around saying that one thing's like when you're like, so you were making the example of sitting around expecting your book to get published, hoping your book will get published. If you're not doing any work, the key difference between expectation and hope is basically work. Is like, you know, action is the main difference. Like, so for example, let's say you go to lift weights and you hope one day to be able to lift 300 pounds, okay? If you are literally in a place of expectation, then you say by next year, I'll be able to lift 300 pounds. There's a time variable tends to be a big issue, right? Well, a year comes by and you're still only doing 260. What tends to occur in expectation is you get really frustrated and you give up because it didn't meet your expectation, you stop lifting weights. Whereas if you were hoping to get to 300, when a year comes up, you go, oh, actually it's going to take longer, but you're open to it taking longer because you don't have an expectation, and so you keep working. And then also when you get to 300, the hoper, then the person who expects once they get to 300, I did it, they got their trophy and they're done. Whereas the person who hopes then to say, oh, well, let's see if we can get to 350. And hope tends to go into hope, but it's very strongly tied to work. Now, here's the other thing about it. So hope, of course, if you're hoping for something, by definition, you have to hope that it's good.
You're not going to hope for something that's bad unless you're, but even if you're a masochist, whatever the bad thing is would be good in a weird way. So whatever, you know, hope is always tied to the good. So, but here's the thing. When you understand that certainty is not possible, you also realize you have no idea what the good is. So you hope for the good, but you don't know what is the good. So you have to be open to whatever presents itself. And also, since you don't know what is the good, you can never stop working, because you can never be sure that whatever arises is the total good or the whole of the good, or there may be something more to it. Michelle was mentioning in the transformative philosophy talk at Voicecraft how uncertainty can be a really empowering thing. Like, we tend to have like negative emotions, and we're very certain about those. But if you're actually uncertain, when you say, oh, that person hates me, uncertainty would actually liberate you, because you say, wait, I actually don't know that, right? So hope also creates a kind of loosening that actually is a good thing, precisely because you go, oh, I don't know what the good is, but I hope that the good will occur. Then you can never stop hoping. Where in expectation, you define the good. You say the good is that in 1 year, I can lift 300 pounds. And if that good doesn't arrive, then it was bad and was false. So why even try? What's the point of expecting? And you give up. Whereas in hope, you're working because you believe that the work itself is changing you in a manner that is good and will condition you and position you to recognize the good when it arrives. But if you do not, that is just a sign that you need to keep going. So hope has intrinsic motivation strongly tied to it, whereas in expectation, there's much more extrinsic motivation. And in expectation, you predict the future, that if it doesn't come unto you, you tend to give up. And if it does come unto you, you quit because you have your trophy. Whereas in hope, if the future you don't expect doesn't come unto you, maybe actually a good thing did occur. You just don't have the ability to know for sure what that is. And so you keep going, and you believe that in the work you are doing, there is an intrinsic valuable that you see, and you see that in your everyday life. And therefore, there's reason to keep hoping in it. If you're like hoping and lifting those weights, then the next week you're able to do 180, a month later 190. Oh, look, there's reason to have hope, because there is progress in the day to day. Hope, the benefits of hope are very tied to the present, whereas the benefits of expectation are in the future, and they are not here yet. So hope has a kind of feedback loop with the present and the future that you're moving to, but not in such a manner that makes you have an expectation of the future that would ever make you quit. So it's tied in the foundational transformation that you're seeing today, while maintaining an intrinsic motivation, where expectation is, the difference is you see a person phenomenologically set up to fail. And so that becomes where you can identify the difference. But absolutely, the brain wants to convince you that when you use the word hope, you're using it in the manner I'm defining, when secretly you might actually have an expectation, because the brain, it doesn't want to friggin' work every day. It wants to, and it doesn't want to be responsible for what it does every day. It wants to expect the world to give it what it wants, while simultaneously seeing itself as humble. So the brain is the frenemy. It's not very friendly, but you also can't get rid of it.
This is true. I think that's very, very good. Yes. And I also think that hope can be seen as denial,
Yes,
or justification at times.
it can be.
I think that's a very interesting element of hope versus expectation, because it also comes in the way your expectations and hopes are communicated. And that brings me on to my next chapter, which says you couldn't have been listening if you don't think like me. And I think it's brilliant, and it fits very well. And I see why it's listed after the first one, Daniel. That makes sense. I'm piecing it together. I'm having an epiphany.
Good girl.
I think something could be an expectation. If I speak to you in an assertive manner and ask you to do it, it almost makes you feel obligated. That means this is my expectation.
Yes.
But then I could think of something hopeful, or, you know, wishful thinking in my head about it. And I could just say, well, I was hoping you'd understand, or I was hoping you'd come, or I was hoping you'd say this, but you didn't. And I think it's very interesting. And this chapter is also brilliant, you know, about you couldn't have been listening if you don't think like me. It's basically what I've been discussing every single day with you, Michelle, you know, about people wanting to hear what they want to hear instead of, you know, what's being said. And I think that's a big problem, because thought is obviously very different. We all think very differently. But then again, I was trying to link both the chapters, because I think it's great, and it opens room for so much conversation, which is the whole point of doing this, and trying to unravel, you know, the inspiration and the hidden message behind these assorted reflections. Daniel, what were your expectations, or rather, what were you hoping to achieve through thoughts?
Well, first on the, very good on connecting, because what ends up happening, basically all of those first three are talking about how, yeah, we all say that we believe there's an external world. We all say that our minds is not the only minds, but practically speaking, we do that all the time. And in fact, we know we can, if we were to straight up say, I think I'm the only mind that exists, that wouldn't work. So we have to go about hiding our belief, our practical belief that we're the only person that exists, through these kind of sneaky ways that it seeps into where we expect instead of hope, where we define listening as someone changing their thoughts to listen, to think like me. We do these kind of sneaky, the brain does these sneaky ways of convincing itself that it doesn't believe that it's the only thing that exists, while practically actually setting itself up to practically be the only thing that exists. And so like on the example of what you're saying on listening, yeah, basically we're like, well, the world must have screwed up if it doesn't meet my expectations. Right? Like, yeah, people must not be very nice if they're not doing what I expect them of me. We're basically saying everything must conform to us or things don't love us. They don't actually love us if they don't conform to us. And therefore we think we're rational to react poorly back or to not love them back or to shut them down. Like we have to do this thing where somehow we feel like we're not being treated as we should be. So then it's okay not to treat other people as they should be treated, right? Like if we just straight up treated people bad, it'd be really hard to self-deceive ourselves into not being bad people. And the brain has to convince itself that it's not bad, because feeling like it's bad is a terrible feeling. But being bad while feeling like you're good is outstanding. That's like the goal of the brain. That's what it wants. And so it has to engage in all these mental gymnastics. And so the first thing, and then I'll give it to Michelle, one of the first things of thoughts is indeed to follow the movement of thoughts to be its own worst enemy. Thoughts tend to be their own worst enemy. The brain tends to be its own worst enemy, and it tends to operate in such a manner to self-deceive itself to the point where it doesn't know it's self-deceiving itself. Because of course, if it knew it was self-deceiving itself, it wouldn't be self-deceived. So the nature of thoughts is basically to be their own worst enemy.
But your thoughts are great. They're definitely not our enemy. I think it's brilliant.
That's very sweet.
It is not our worst enemy, and it certainly isn't yours. And I hope we're all blessed with such remarkable thoughts, really.
You're sweet. You're sweet.
So Sandy. Thank you. Yeah, I think one of the things that I love and have learned so well from you, Sandy, is your idea, which is, when you go to say something to somebody else, they're probably just going to read it the way they want to. They're just going to interpret it anyways. So don't write the novel. Don't write the thing that you want to send to the person to clarify yourself and explain yourself, because they're just going to read it the way they're going to read it from what they want to hear from it, not because it's intentionally some sort of selfish thing. It's just the way that our brains work, and it really takes a lot of effort to remember that the hermeneutical difference of interpretation is always there, even in the same language, even in the same family. This is very, very much just the part of the fabric of our language and our orienting towards one another. But the thing is, what happens in such an exchange, right? Where you sometimes see in meme language or social media language about girl, don't write the novel, or whatever you want to explain yourself to the man, don't do it. The thing is that why she wants to is because she wants to make sure she wants to feel understood in what she's trying to explain. She wants the person to understand. She wants the guy to understand completely what she's trying to say. She hopes that it will be understood, that she will be understood. But the thing is that how it's taken.
But that hope becomes an expectation when the guy doesn't respond back.
Right, when you send an emoji thumb or something, or just left it on scene or whatever. Well, that's the thing. The thing is that hope is so entrenched in expectation that it's very hard. It takes so much. It takes so much of a type of almost death to what we understand as hope to really kind of allow ourselves to be transformed into real hope, to be to transcend into real hope. Because a lot of our hopes are actually, like you're saying, just expectations in the negative sense. In the sense of where we set ourselves up for disappointment constantly. We set ourselves up for self-degradation because, I didn't meet my goal, so I'm never going to do X, Y, or Z. And so I think what's interesting about this is two-part is this understanding of because there's this interesting thing where it's because you'll never necessarily know for sure if the person actually understands. There's such an element of trust that has to be involved in relationships, right? And I actually, one of the papers I wrote a long time ago was about trust, because it interests me so much, where there's trust that's always operating, and we don't realize we're always extending it to each other. Then if we don't realize that, then we kind of feel like it has to be proven, but it's actually already the mode of how we exist with each other. And yes, there's a whole lot more to that, but basically this idea of like, there's an element in which I think this is part of the transcendent hope, is trust too, right? Because trust is related to truth. So like a lot of times trusting that somebody understands you, and that like they don't need, books and books and books of like, the novel of explanation. They understand who you are. So just go ahead and tell them whatever it is that's to the point and to the purpose of what they might need to know, so that they can whatever move on, or you can reconcile, or have forgiveness and then move on. So it's kind of like, I think for me, this is brings it into this idea of hope transcending could maybe mean tapping it into the other infinities, right? Beauty, truth, goodness, because then it can elevate it out of just its entrenchedness in expectation in the negative sense. Now, one redeeming thing to the word expectation is I think about it as a mother when you're expecting a baby, right? The nice thing about that, and thinking about it in that way, is that you have an expectation of what you're having a child, right? A human being. But there's so many unexpected things, right? Well, for us, it's like, will it be a boy? Will it be a girl? We never found out until we had the baby. What will they be like? Will they look? What will their personalities be? Will they be a good sleeper? Will they have whatever? All the things, right? That's another topic. But the point of the matter is, the nice thing with the idea of expectation in pregnancy is that you carry it. Right. And this has to do with the idea of hope. In the transcendent idea of hope, is that something that you actually have to do yourself. You don't just expect the world to kind of bring it to you and make it happen for you and blah, blah, blah. You go ahead and take some initiative and take some, I don't like the word initiative necessarily in this case, but let's just think about it. You can have some agency, right? You can have some agency in what you are bringing about and what are you offering, instead of just thinking about it like it's just going to somehow emerge and be given to you. How do people even know? You never even opened your mouth to say what you wanted. I mean, a lot of times that happens too. It's like these hopes are entrenched in expectation that are unspoken, and nobody has a clue. And then, or it's overly spoken because you're so afraid to not be understood or to explain yourself. And it's like, so I think a lot of this has to do with this, like, how do we get the hope to transcend into like something that's higher, that is in line with beauty, truth, and goodness, truth having to do also with trust. I think there's a lot of having to have the ability to understand that there's something that you are involved with in the agency of hope, right? And then also to not allow it to get so cramped into certainty and feeling certain, and a lot of it is just feeling certain, feeling like you're understood, feeling like there's not a problem. Then don't go and make problems if there's not. But like the idea of, I think there's a lot of times this feeling of we want to feel stable, we want to feel like everything's certain, we want to feel blah blah blah, instead of being uncomfortable, instead of allowing ourselves to feel uncomfortable and to push into that and allow for that, and allow for some of the things that just have to abide in the place of trust. I hope that's
and I'll just add, it's very important to realize that all concepts, everything has a kind of slippage to it. Like you can be hoping today and like 5 minutes later be expecting. And you can be expecting them to, like, they all, like, you can be listening to someone, like, truly listening to them and not expect, and then, like, tomorrow, though, you've gone back to, like, expecting them to think like you. Like, it's so important that just because you know the difference between, like, the brain being a frenemy and, like, being something you can rely on all the time doesn't mean, practically speaking, next week when you're, like, sleepy, you don't go into the bed. Like, there is no perfect state. Like, everything we're describing requires an active management to stay in. And that's where it's tricky. Like, we've kind of been taught to believe that if you have the right ideas, you will therefore have the right life. If you know the difference between hope and expectation, you're good to go. And knowing that, like, you don't have, like, basically any chance of not being in, like, perpetual chaos slippage if you don't know the distinction. But just because you know the distinction doesn't mean the slippage stops, as I'm describing it. And that's so important, because we've basically been led by school to believe that once you know something, it's done. You're set. Right? It's not the case at all. Like when you talk about metaphysical realities and valuations and all this kind of stuff, it's always slipping. Like the concepts are always slipping back. Your brain's slipping back into old habit. Like you've really got to be paying attention. And it's easy to believe, like, well, your brain doesn't want to think that. And that's the problem. Like your brain has to remember this and it doesn't want to remember this. So this creates a lot of problems. I think also what I'll say on the hope thing, there's a way to think about it is basically, you don't have any grounds to hope for anything that you're not every single day acting toward. Like if you're not acting every day toward X, you really don't have grounds to hope. right? You know, like all you can do is expect. Like if you're like hope, like what is your grounds for hoping? Now you can talk about like various like theological hopes of the person of Jesus coming and different things like that, but that's all in God's agency. And you can have like this kind, you can make a distinction between a theological hope. But if we're talking about hope, say like getting a book published, being in a relationship, improving, and so on and so forth. Certainly, you could talk about God working in that. But are you acting in a manner to draw yourself closer to God? Even that has a certain sort of action that would be part of it, right? Like if you believe that God gives man free will, then you believe that God thinks that humans ought to act in a manner to draw themselves closer to him, right? So really, like we talk about hope as something you have or don't, in the same way, when really hope is something you earn or not, it's something you work toward or not. And if you're not every single day, like if you're like, oh, I hope to be married every single day. Well, what are you doing to not be a jerk? Like, what are you doing to listen to people? Are you working on we all have the natural tendency to not listen to other people while having their words pass over us. Are we working every day at that? Like, are we working at being able to tell the difference between liking and loving? Because they're very similar, right? Are we working at that? If not, then our hope to be in a relationship one day, well, one, it doesn't have any ground, and two, it might be a terrible thing because you get in a relationship and it's endless drama, right? So the thing that you're hoping for is not what you thought it was, right? And so I think it's really important to think about hope as something you do. Hope is something you do. And if you're not doing it, then you don't have it. And I think that can go a long way.
I think that's very good. Yes, I think, you know, the example of a relationship as well, love is supposed to be a practice and not a habit, because sometimes you can become very bad at your habits and you might just do it for the sake of doing it. And there is a sense of consciousness that is invested when you make it a practice. And so, yes, you'd be married for more days than the others. Now, when you talk about expectation and hope and listening versus understanding, there is also language that plays a key role in differentiating hope and expectation, and the tone and the figure of speech is used. And like I said earlier, you could be assertive and seem demanding, or, you know, expect that the other person is obligated to deliver on this expectation. Or you could be soft-spoken and make it seem like you're hoping this would happen, or you'd hope that this person would understand your mind. But innately, you're being selfish in both ways, like we said. So when it comes to the way we speak and about not writing the novel, Michelle, we might not say anything, but no message is also a message if one is able to understand the silence that's delivering the message. So and especially language in this book is brilliant. You've written very succinctly, and it's very intricate and simple, yet very, very sophisticated, Daniel. And I think language plays a key role in understanding thoughts, and I have enjoyed reading this book so far. I haven't finished it, of course, because I don't want to. That's the whole point, because if it's finished...
You don't want her expectation ruined. It's like the next size, it's all going down. So
yeah, so that means I will have more expectations for you to deliver on another book.
There you go.
So I'm just hoping to prolong the finality of this book, which means I give you more time to deliver on my expectations.
There you go. See, secretly the brain's working there. So different things.
Yes, indeed.
But you're very sweet. Thank you, Sam.
So yes, I think language plays a key role in the way we communicate hope and expectation, and our understanding of those two things is also, you know, shaped by the kind of tone and language and the mood we set. So what are your thoughts on that? That when we discuss hope and expectation, how do you think it differs by the way we communicate through language?
Well, one of the things I think is very important, again, philosophy without phenomenology is basically doomed just to be a language game. And Wittgenstein was kind of correct about that. Derrida was kind of correct about that. But again, the thing I'll say about like Derrida is that there's still the metaphysics of apprehension, which would be in the phenomenological. And yeah, philosophy that's just kind of not very phenomenological tends to be a language game. The other thing too with that is, for me, the probability that one in writing, say, philosophical essays accidentally slips into merely discussing language increases a lot when you have complicated language, because you tend to fall into discussing a technical language. You as the writer start talking about a technical object that is just a technical object, not a practical object, and not even realizing it. Now, you know, someone may read a paper like Reconstructing ASA and be like, this is really complicated language. So I don't mean to say that the language is always simple or things like that, but they're definitely, if you take phenomenology seriously, I think that definitely requires, I mean, the main thing we do is creative writing. That definitely puts an emphasis on literary thinking, language, and words like that. Language is tragic. Like, the moment we're dealing with language, we're dealing with objects to refer to things that are not those objects. So we're at risk, right? Immediately. The moment you speak, you're at risk. And yet, if you don't speak, there's a, without language, the human subject does not develop. Like, I think Lacan basically says the subconscious is language. Like, there is something profoundly linguistical about the brain. Now, I'm not saying it's just words. You can have like communication through images. There's a lot of people who think in images, but images are dangerous. Like, a painting of something is not the thing itself either, right? And so the way we understand, this is like the problem. The way we understand is through something that is not the thing we're trying to understand. Yeah. So we're in huge trouble right out the gate. And so how do you think and work in such a manner to lower the probability that you are actually just discussing language in language? Like, how do you do that? And that gets into phenomenology. I think basically, like, one of the things that kills the philosophical essay in academia is they have to beef it up. And Davoud mentioned this. There's a certain word count. There's a certain page. They have to go through like the whole history of philosophy in every book. And so they get lost from the main subject they're describing in the demands of academia, for example, or in the demands to cite a certain amount. And that can lead to where you're discussing a technical object and not a lived object or different things. So those would get into that. The style for me correlates with a strong desire not to accidentally be discussing language per se, or to just be in a language game. When I say language, I mean language game, as Wittgenstein says, which is just simply like a board you set up in the terms of the paper that are simply referring to one another, that don't correspond with anything in reality. Now, of course, the problem is you can never be certain that you're not in a language game. So how do you increase the probability that you're not? Well, that gets into the style, that gets into the phenomenology, that gets into length and all in different topics like that.
Indeed. Now that we've talked about language, let's talk a little bit about inspiration and what inspired thoughts. And I know you mentioned Davoud, and in some of the essays you mentioned, you know, the people that you host on your channel, and, you know, the writers that you write with, all the different papers on Medium and Substack, and it's all wonderful. So what collectively inspired thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's meant to be kind of an organic collection of reflections that is very much like, if you look back on the past, you know, maybe year or two, I mean, some of these can go back quite a ways, but they're kind of categorized in sort of the things and the themes of the past while of other conversations that have been had, because a lot of the reflections are also birthed from those conversations, and or, you know, inspired by other people's work, and maybe what it provoked in a good sense, like what did it stimulate. And so I think that it's really, I don't want to use that word too much, but I do feel like it's a very organic, they're genuinely reflections on current, you know, thoughts and what's been kind of on the philosophical scene, if you will, in this kind of funny little corner of the web of the people that we have the privilege of engaging with. So yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it was also to kind of speak to what is happening right now, you know, with current, very up-to-date sort of thinking philosophically, what people are doing creatively on the web. And I think it's really cool to see that too, as tied to a lot of the reflections. But I think what's great is that the thoughts in general too, though, is going to pull from a lot of like, even the Conflict of Mind or some of the other works of ours that then sort of show sort of at least the O.J. Rose kind of fundamentals of epistemology and ontology, some of those things that kind of ground a lot of the thinking in general, and the phenomenology too. So yeah, I think that it's kind of a nice blend of that, of kind of like what our thoughts are generally, like some of our foundational thoughts, and then how do those dialecticize with the other people in this community. So it's really great, and I think it's very organic out of those conversations and out of, you know, what's been the theme of the work that's also has been being done our side too.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing, and that very good. The other side to that is like taking those essays you mentioned. So, for example, if you're going through the world and you see and witness, not think, observe phenomenologically, where it seems like expectations cause people trouble, like drama, but then you also know that hope is good, right? And if you see drama, then there's a high probability there's some sort of idea problem. Like there are some sort of concepts that are an issue because no one intends to get in drama, right? No one intends to cause pain between, especially in like family or relationships, right? Like that's a very fertile ground to determine when there is likely some sort of intellectual mistake, because you have people that you have a very high probability, there's a very high chance they have good intentions and they genuinely care about one another, right? And yet they end up in drama. Well, how is that possible? Like, how can that occur? Well, there must be some sort of mistake in an idea, right? That doesn't that unintentionally leads to mistake or drama. Or if you look in the political arena, like no one, like if you see these constant drama or these constant problems, yes, at this point, Republicans and Democrats basically hate each other, but that was not always the case, right? So what gradually led to an utter devolution of the political scene from people that you assume all care about America, right? Like if we're living in America, right? You assume there's very good reason to believe that anyone who goes to Washington D.C. and politically involved has, you can easily, oh, well, they're all corrupt and they don't. Well, that's an easy answer. Like that's simplistic. Like what's a more profound thing? Well, what if people have genuine good intentions, but their ideas about how to go about those good intentions make things worse? Well, now we have a much more complicated problem. And if you try to think that, which is happening, it's not just in your head imagined, it's happening, then there's a higher probability you're going to arrive at philosophical concepts that are needed and useful, because you literally see things happening in the world that are not good, or you see people who care about one another causing one another pain. So, for example, I think like many relationships are hurt by not having some sort of sense that there's a distinction between hope and expectation. I think that hurts people all the time. I think in not having a distinction between memorization and remembering. I think education is hurt all the time by that. And you see the consequences of it. I think you see all the time where people use pragmatism as a sort of moral high road, not realizing that their pragmatism is defined by the socioeconomic order they are, and they end up living lives they don't want to live precisely because they didn't realize pragmatism was captured in a Deleuzian sense by a system that they didn't understand. So when you witness those things and you see those things occurring and you're deciding like what you're going to write about, well, one, there's a high probability to believe something needs to be written, right, in these circumstances. And then two, precisely because it's making the world a worse place, there's a motivation to do this. Like there's a motivation to do it because you yourself, here's the other key move. If you see this happening to other people, why can't it happen to you? Why won't you end up in that boat? And once you get that the brain is in the business of self-deception, well, you want to engage in the work to make sure you don't enter into that self-deception, right? So now there's a motivation. Whereas if I just one day say, oh, I'd like to write a commentary on Kant's third critique, that's pretty dry. I don't know if there's the same motivation, but most people go about philosophical work like that. But when you bind it to the phenomenological, you locate it within people of goodwill, basically. And then three, you assume the good intention. This opens up an entire world of sort of thinking. And so much of thoughts come out of that, in addition to going through all of the communities we're in, thinking about their work, exploring that work, as Michelle mentioned. So I would say those are kind of two main sources of thought. And that would apply beyond thoughts into many of the books.
That's great. Yes, thank you for that. I think, Daniel, you make a very interesting point about, when you talked about relationships and politics and how we set ourselves up for disappointment. And, some could also argue that we find drama because we actively seek it.
Sure.
And I feel like it's a fine line. Sometimes you do it unintentionally, but I also feel like drama is created because we expect the other person to be who we are, or rather meet the potential of who we think they're capable of being, instead of acknowledging the reality of it. And I think with thought, there is this virtual reality versus what is actually fact. And that's always created, a huge room of debate in the philosophy community, like, okay, what is fact, what is reality? But they're both thoughts, and some thoughts are spoken into truth, and that truth becomes power, and it begins to exist. So circling back to setting ourselves for disappointment, I feel like there is a sense of expectation and hope, both. Who is selfless or innately an empath would just be hopeful that the other person would meet the potential that you expect them to meet in your head. But someone who's more demanding would be aggressive about it, or frustrated about it, that why is this person not becoming or reaching their full potential now that they've achieved or finally convince this other person to be with them. And I think there's a fine line. But do you really think that it's just the way they think, but there is also a need of coherent communication there? Because in the end of the day, we can always think a lot of things, but will seldom be understood. But with communicating, there is a way of actually telling them, like, I need you to be better at X, Y, and Z. And even then, there is so much room for drama. So yes, I mean, if you're not listening, if you don't think like me, that's basically it. Because that's the truth. I mean, there is still so much drama because of that. And I think that that essay title is brilliant because of that. It's one of the chapters that I could relate to mostly. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's you're bringing up a great point, Sandy. And I think that the whole idea, I think, of having ideas and working through them and, even to formulate thoughts itself is to kind of hopefully give some sort of bearings, right? There is a lot of uncertainty of what's understood, what's not understood. At the end of the day, is it just what we want it to be, what we want it to, all of that. But what I think thoughts does is it allow us to be a bit more thoughtful, right? A bit more, a little bit more self-skeptical, about what we sort of assume, right? And what we feel so certain about. And even like I think you've put a very good juxtaposition of somebody who, like the empath, and then the person who's a bit more demanding. Like both people are in the wrong, right? Because they either one under communicates but still has the hope or expectation, and the other person over communicates in a sense, and they have this hope and expectation, and it's kind of smothering the other person. And I think that the idea of a lot of the ideas that are in thoughts, the undercurrent is irony, right? That like irony is the fabric of reality, right? So that like every time you kind of, that's the thing, irony is uncertainty, and we don't like to accept it, but a lot of our lives, a lot of times what we do is ironic, right? Or it's in the paradox, it's in the irony that we kind of are able to sort of like things are on their head, and we kind of get to situate them back upside down again. And so I think that, to me, though at the end of the day, we can still be in this land of like, well, we can't be sure, or what if it's just what do we want it to be, what we want it to hear. I think that thoughts tries to give some bearings, and actually, like, instead of just being in the kind of chaos of that uncertainty, so there's the chaos of the uncertainty, or there's the kind of like just dogmatic, egoistic sort of like, I'm just gonna bunker down on what I think and what I know because it's just feels more comfortable. Both are kind of a place of, can sometimes actually be a place of finding comfort, right? The empath who doesn't really talk, and it's just like, I'll just kind of almost go with the flow too much, right? Because I think there's kind of, this is the thing, thoughts is trying to bring up this irony. You can never really be like, it can never be, even uncertainty can become one's type of certainty in a bad way, okay? Because the thing is, you still have to kind of decide to live in certain ways, right? And make certain decisions. So there's this sort of understanding that actually the true uncertainty is to be dialectical, to understand that to get some sort of bearings so that we can embrace the right type of uncertainty, so that we can actually have genuine connection and relation to each other. Because ultimately what Daniel's talking about, where you see these problems, you see this drama, again, like, and even everybody is very susceptible to this, even when they know better, right? They are still susceptible to it because well, we're just humans. But the thing is that when you see that, what are all of those? It's relational, it's disconnect, right? It's relational issues with self. Even a lot of times it starts with like, you're not relating to yourself properly, so you can't relate to anyone else properly, right? Because we all think that we know how to do it well, or we don't, or we realize like it's not working, but we feel so certain that it will always be that way. So anyways, I guess what I mean to say is that I think that thoughts can really speak to getting a bearings of embracing the right type of uncertainty so that we can genuinely relate to each other. Because I always think about this, the word communicating has to do with communion. So if we can't really genuinely commune with each other, if there's not really a genuine type of communion in the nourishing sense, like taking communion in the kind of religious sense, then there's really no ability for us to actually effectively communicate, right? And a lot of times genuine communication is also going to be the non-verbal things, the things about you that, again, could never be really said in words. There's just kind of, you just know, you get the sense of knowing. Well, that can only ever develop with time, through time of communing to have the communication. So I think what I mean to say is that, like, what the biggest thing for me that's understanding irony being the fabric of reality does is to start to not be so certain of what you are so certain you're certain about, even if that certainty is uncertainty, and then to embrace the right type of uncertainty so that you can be open to a genuine relating to the other. And I think that's what a lot of the essays and thoughts allow us to sort of get an orientation in. It's not, it's still, it's a guide, and we're still going to slip, as Daniel talks about, but it kind of at least gives us a framework for how to kind of get back on a track of genuine relating. And ultimately that's beautiful, that's freeing, that's like enlivening, and brings so much beauty, joy, truth, goodness, all of the good things to life. And it also embraces the fact that there is hardship in life, but that's not a sore point. It's an aspect of the reality of life. So anyways, just want to say that.
So a few things. And alas, I guess we have to get Miss Grace and the children say hello
Yes.
to you, but they have,
Yes.
the dance and different things.
Yes,
so.
I'd get them to
I would love that.
art
Yes,
school later.
and we'll have to do it again because this has been a delight.
Yes,
and
Sandy, you're so
we've got through
wonderful.
we got like 3 or 4, so we got 96 left to go through. So
Yes,
that's all
we do.
go.
And I intend on unraveling all the mysteries.
Nice.
Oh, yes.
Well done,
It's really
Sandy. Well
I would
done.
also quickly like to say thank you for having me narrate some of the beautiful paragraphs that you've written. The pleasure's been mine, and
you're sweet.
I've thoroughly enjoyed every bit of it. And I hope everyone out there goes and gets their copy of Thoughts. This is not a paid advertisement. I am inspiring you to go pursue philosophy and literary genius.
Well, you're very sweet,
So
and
kind, Sandy.
and you're very sweet, and I would just say, so that Habermas, and I like it, but then I don't like it. He talks about communicative rationality, and where he's very concerned about philosophy being in the business of communication. I think he's correct, but then what ends up happening is, because I think he's very tied to the Enlightenment project, there's a notion of, well, what needs to happen is like we establish good communication, which is necessary for democracy, by all agreeing on the facts. And facts become kind of the transcendent grounding of which is then going to bind together. I don't think that works, because what constitutes a fact is relative to worldview. Even if you all say 2 + 2 = 4 and that's a fact, that seems pretty self-evident, right? We can all agree with that. Well, here's the thing. There's a big debate on if numbers are created or realized. Like, there is behind that fact an entire debate on the ontological status of numbers, right? If you say, oh, it's a fact that this cup is a cup, we can all agree it's kind of teal, right? Okay, but we don't agree on the significance of that fact. And if that's a fact, we should pay attention to. So I don't think merely trying to base a new communicative rationality on the grounds of fact is going to work, even if facts matter, because facts do not tell you the worldview in which they are situated in and should be situated in. So that would mean if we're going to have a new communicative rationality, it has to be based basically on the taking seriously the frenemy brain, the fact that irony is the fabric of reality, that humans are self-deception creatures, and it has to be a perpetual active thought. You can't have a communicative rationality that is in the business of arriving at facts. You have to have a communicative rationality that is always in the business of uprooting itself and not falling into solidity. But that's a very different, that's almost like Habermas would be considered I think he's considered part of the analytical tradition. He certainly positions himself as a child of the Enlightenment. This is almost kind of like a continental communicative rationality. You have the continental analytical divide, and I don't even think the philosophers came up with that. I think that was like a term some news person came up with, and it screwed everything up. But anyway, so communication is a big deal for philosophy. The question is, what are the grounds of that communication? What is the business of communication? And I think we have to see it as in the working against the very human subject that is using communication in ways to hide from itself, and to be working in a creative act and to find these distinctions and then to maintain them from slippage. So the other thing I would say is, human beings engage in, say, self-destruction, right? Humans engage in like creating drama because they like, oh, I need to have this fight because we got to get to the truth, right? These things happen. But here's like the difference. Let's look at self-destruction, where a human being self-sabotage, where a human like engages in self-sabotage. So the first way to look at it is kind of a negative motivation, where you say, well, they're just stupid.
or they're just hopeless, right? That's why they're doing it. Well, there's no thought. Philosophy's over there. You say, okay, it's because they're dumb. All right, we're done. But what if we were to say, wait a minute, humans are all, Augustine was right. Humans, by definition, must be motivated by what they think is good. That doesn't mean it is good, and that doesn't mean there isn't evil, but motivation is always toward a good. Yeah. How in the world could self-sabotage be good to a person who is engaging that motivation? Well, notice here now philosophy is very much alive. Whereas in the first, when you assume a bad motivation, philosophy is over because they're stupid. There's nothing to think. But if you say, wait a minute, what if people engage in self-sabotage because it's one of the few times you can feel like you have certainty in your life? Like we feel certain of stuff when it goes bad. And guess what? If you don't always have control over your success, but man, it feels like you have control over your failure. And now you have power. Now you feel like the world is not, Nietzsche said the world is unchained from the sun, God is dead and flying off. In self-sabotage, there's actually a feeling that God is alive and you're God. And it feels great because you're always lost in a postmodern chaos of not knowing what's going on. And dang it, I'm not going to fail because the system crushes me. I'm going to fail by my own power, and in that finally have power, right? Yeah. Well, now we have you see, like once you assume a good motivation, you can arrive at a much more fruitful and interesting concept and possibility versus just assuming that they have a negative motivation. And the fact of the matter is, what we just said about feeling like you're God by orchestrating your own death is probably closer to the truth than the person just being stupid, because it's actually probably closer to the truth. That's the thing. Philosophy, even though it comes up with this kind of strange answer of what I was just saying about a person like being their own dying God, it's actually probably closer to the truth because it is kind of a fact that humans don't have bad motivation. Like that actually is a kind of fact. Humans are not motivated by what they think is bad for themselves. You can't find it. Like if a person says, I'm going to cut my hand, they think it's good to cut their hand. It is like axiomatically the case that motivation is always toward what it believes is a good end, even if it's actually bad. Okay. So our tendency basically is to deal with other people in complicated situations by assuming bad motive or stupidity or inability. And sure, maybe those things are the case to some degree, but you don't have to think. And when you don't have to think, the probability that you're dealing with the actual world is far, far less. So many of the essays and thoughts, and basically in O.G. Rose in general, just arise out of examining a situation, taking seriously the facts that people have good motivations. You take that seriously, that forces you to think about basically everything, and to think about basically everything in new ways. And when you see drama, versus going, oh, they just like to cause trouble, well, then there's nothing to think. But when you see drama, go, wait a minute, people are motivated by the good. So people have ended up in this drama somehow motivated by what they think is good. How can that be? How can that be? What must that be? And then you have to think that. And when you think that and you learn that, you tend to get better at dealing with people. And at the end of the day, thoughts is in the business of relationships because we are always dealing and living in relationships. The problem is that when we don't think, we tend to be bad at them. So we have to engage in thoughts.
Well, on that note, Daniel,
It's been a pleasure.
The pleasure's been all mine. Thank you for taking the time to speak with me and to discuss thoughts. And I hope we can do it soon. And I would ask the listeners to stay tuned and even, send their own thoughts on thoughts. So go grab your copy and reflect with us.
Thank you,
Sanduni. You're awesome. See you now.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.